Well, I would say it's probably less than the 4 stars than the job I took. I'm the 38th Vice Chief of Naval Operations, and I'm the #2 person in the Navy, and we're responsible for everything related to training, equipping, and manning the force. And so that is a large scope. We have 326,000 active sailors, over 59,000 reservists, and a couple 100,000 civilians. So this particular job has really changed my perspective, but it's only made me cherish the people we have all the more. I would say as the #2, I'm also responsible for the good order and discipline. In the Navy, we talk about the #2 of ships as the executive officer, and you help regulate the well-being and then the behavior of the entire crew. So I'm kind of like the XO for the entire Navy, the #2 for the entire Navy. So our people are great, but they're sometimes imperfect. And when imperfections happen, it's my job to help get people on the right track. I don't know that I had an inkling I was going to go this far. I had only been a 3-star, oh gosh, maybe 10, 11 months when the CNO was traveling through town. I was down in Norfolk, and he asked to see me, and I presumed it was about the next job I was going to. I was supposed to go up to be his lead strategist and planner, and then that's when he talked to me about, we're looking at you for being a 4-star, and here's a couple of different opportunities where we think you would, do well and benefit the Navy. And he said it's a big transition, and this is something I think you probably want to talk to your family about and come back to me and let me know if you think you're the right person to do one of these 2 jobs. She still lives with me. She's 82. Oh, she was enthusiastic. She said, Michelle, you're the right person because you're a leader. But she goes, in this case, you're also the right person because of where we are with women in the nation. And she said, I think you should do it. He was Air Force Master Sergeant. In England, my father was stationed in Mendenhall, England in the 50s, and my mother was a British citizen by birth. So they met over there and fell in love and got married, and my older brother was born there, and then they came back to the United States. And as a family, we traveled, moved every couple of years, and so the 4 children, boy, girl, were representative of the mobility of any of the services. My older brother was born in England. I was born in California. My younger brother was born in Guam, and my sister was born in Colorado. Just my older brother and myself. I did. And I saw this documentary on television, and it just enthralled me. And I was like, yes, that's what I want to do. And I went to talk to my older brother and said, hey, I want to do this thing. It looks great. And he goes, no, service academies are closed to women. And I didn't believe him. He said, no, it's the law. And I thought he was just messing with me. He's an older brother. So I go to my mom, and she's like, no, the service academies are closed to women. It's the law. And I just felt like the world was out of place. And then she said, well, wait a minute, you're only 12. You may change your mind. But as you get older, if you still want to go, you should apply. And then if you're not accepted, we'll sue the government. And I was like, what? And she walked me through this great thought process. She said, look, you have to go after what you want to do in life and what you think is right. And she said the way it works, if you sue the government, it could take years. And you might be too old to go by the time the Supreme Court agrees with you that it's right to change the law. But it's also just as important, if the Supreme Court changes the law and another woman gets to go instead, you've done the right thing. So it was a big moment of understanding of persistence and doing what you think's right despite naysayers for me. You know, I honestly don't know why, but I do know I ended up speaking to someone who was a former Secretary of the Navy during that time frame, and it was at a dinner, and he said he first heard about service academies opening up under President Nixon. Nixon had called the political leadership at DOD and said we need to start going down this path. So the idea started before President Ford came into office. I'm a class of 1982, so I started in 1978. So I was in the third year group. The first class of women graduated in 80, so they started in 76. And I think it was as much a reflection of where society was at the time. I think about the 70s, and we didn't have a women's Supreme Court justice. I mean, that was around the time Sandra Day O'Connor was nominated. Sally Ride hadn't started life as an astronaut, and there were a lot of changes going on in the country. You think about women were just starting to become police officers and firefighters, and that change was hard on some people. And so Annapolis was a microcosm. More than one, but what I really remember is towards the end of our first year, which is called the Plea Year, my roommates and I, the other three women who were all roommates for life because of that experience, we talked to each other and we said, you know what, if we ever get to the point where one of us wants to quit, then we're going to have to convince the other three that we want to quit for our own reasons, not because we're being pressured to leave. And I think it was that pact and the conversations that allowed all four of us to graduate. So when you think about my graduating from Annapolis in 1982, so literally it's a quarter of a century later that I'm selected to 1 star, equivalent to a brigadier general in the Marine Corps or Army. I was the first one in my class to be selected for that rank. But interestingly enough, even though there were women in 2-year groups ahead of me, I was the first woman of graduates to be selected for the rank of Rear Admiral. First of all, walking around as a Rear Admiral lower half is pretty neat. I mean, or walking around as a brigadier general. And between 2007 and 2010, I had some really great opportunities and really great missions. 2009, I became head of the Counter-Piracy Task Force, and a few days on the job, Captain Phillips was kidnapped, and so it was our responsibility as a task force to get him back and get him back safely. And that was obviously a surprise kind of a mission and a challenge, and you know, it was all about taking care of him, getting him a medical checkup, and offering him any kind of help he needed. And then very quickly, everybody, literally everyone in the world wanted to talk to him, including the President of the United States. And you know, to me, the most important thing was giving him a chance to talk to his family and letting them know he was okay. And then literally, we did not meet again until the movie premiere in Washington, D.C. But it was great closure for me to get to see him, you know, years later with his wife, and he just looked great. And I will tell you one story. When we got him on board the USS Boxer, we were talking, and I had some things. I asked him, you know, here's some things. Do you want to read? And he said, yeah, but I don't have any reading glasses. So I gave him my reading glasses, and he's like, how old are you? We eventually moved him over to another ship to get him back ashore. And I think it was a few weeks later, somebody comes working their way back, and they show up, and it's a guy who's hopping around the ships. He's got my glasses. He says, Captain Phillips wanted to make sure you got your reading glasses back. And I thought, my goodness, with everything else he's got going on in his life, and this getting through this huge traumatic ordeal he could remember to try and get back a pair of reading glasses to someone who's at sea. So in December of 2008, there was a UN resolution where the transitional government of Somalia said, we agree. We don't have a functioning government. We clearly don't have a functioning Coast Guard or Navy. We invite the other militaries of the world, other countries of the world, to help us fight piracy. And they authorized, through a UN resolution language, for other governments of the world to be able to patrol the waters, in the territorial waters of Somalia, to fight pirates. That was a huge step and breakthrough. So our government said, okay, we're going to stand up a counter-piracy task force. And that a task force is just a group of military assets, in this case ships, and people, the staffs who do the planning. And we set up an international one. So over time, dozens upon dozens of countries have participated. At the time I took over, we had Singaporean support, Turkish support, and then of course US ships in it, US Marines in it. And we were at that time trying to understand the clan's pattern of life, how they were going about kidnapping and trying to get ransom for people. And then we were just patrolling the waters off the Gulf of Aden and Somalia, trying to stop the Piracy Act. And then we were also trying to catch pirates in the act, videotape them, because in the end, you're doing a law enforcement mission on behalf of another country. So we had to have a sort of chain of evidence. We could not only just grab people in the act of piracy, we had to be able to collect the weapons and anything else that they were going to use to take people, kidnap people, and then find another country that would be willing to prosecute them under piracy. So our country has prosecuted people. Many European countries have prosecuted people. Kenya stepped up and did a lot of the prosecutions. And then once they go through the process, if they were found guilty of piracy, then many of them ended up with jail or prison time. We did not have special forces with us. They came by later. So our big task was to stop that life raft from getting ashore, and that was quite a challenge, to try in a way to convince the pirates to stop movement without over-pressurizing the situation and have them do untold harm to Captain Phillips. And then the special forces showed up, and then we integrated as a team and worked our way through here, what are our options for rescuing Captain Phillips. So a rear admiral is a 2-star, a vice admiral is a 3-star, equivalent to a lieutenant general in the Marine Corps or Army. And then I would say a significant step up normally in the scope of what you're doing. So in my first vice admiral job, I was the deputy commander for Fleet Forces Command. And that is the part of the Navy that has oversight probably for about a third of our fleet. It's about 120,000 sailors, submarines, carriers, aircraft, intelligence centers, expeditionary forces, and so it's the day-to-day running of the fleet. It's the integrated training. So you train ships or an explosive ordnance detachment as an individual unit, and then at some point they have to be able to cooperate and work together and fight together. So then you have to somehow create the conditions where you have a group of ships or different types of ships and assets train together and be able to fight together. And that's a pretty complicated process. We met in Holy Loch, Scotland. He was the security officer on the ship. And then I transferred, and then we were pen pals for quite a while because I transferred to a ship in Florida, and then we dated for about 4 years. I'm the first woman to reach the rank of 4 stars in the United States Navy. And literally when I called up the uniform center, and said, hey, I need women 4-star shoulder boards. Women's shoulder boards are different make than the men's. I expected the answer I got, which is, we don't actually have any. I thought, well, there you have it. I'm the first one. So they had to put out a special contract, and it ended up being Vanguard that made them. And then women's shoulder boards slide on an epaulet instead of clipping on. And so these were brand new, and the pocket wasn't quite open. And so it's definitely a historic event, because that's the first time those had ever been worn by a woman admiral. And my husband and Secretary Mavis were struggling with trying to get those things on. But what was really neat is a few weeks later, Vanguard sent me photographs of the team who put the shoulder boards together. And it turns out, in that side of their Taylor house, it turned out it was an all-women team. From the women who cut the cloth to doing the embroidery for the stars. And so they sent me pictures of the 4 women who made these historic boards, and I was able to sign a thank you out to each of them. So it's this concept of when you think about her as a woman leader, not just as a queen, and literally the fight against the Spanish Armada. When you talk about iconic leadership in charge of a flotilla, that's an early example. But the other thing is, when you look at history, she was among the first to recognize the necessity of the freedom of seas, which is now in international law. The high seas are global commons. And the way Queen Elizabeth phrased it, it is of public necessity that the seas be free. And she is absolutely right. The lifeblood of the world is trade, it's commerce. And most of the commerce of the world moves by the oceans. So if the oceans aren't safe, if people like Captain Phillips can't get from A to B without having their cargo seized, then trade collapses. And that's the purpose of navies. The 4 service chiefs make up the Joint Chiefs of Staff. No, the CNO is, when the CNO's on travel, then I move in his stead and represent naval matters, and I'm the Naval Adviser basically to the chairman in that forum. So the 4 chiefs help formulate that device for the chairman to give to the president. And it's become a true process over decades as law has changed. And it's significant now because the chairman, by law, when he provides advice to the president, if any of the chiefs has a dissenting opinion, he's required to also provide that dissenting opinion to the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. So the chiefs provide context, and I think in some cases that collection of operational experience, wisdom, for the chairman to help develop that military advice. I can't speak to a comparison. I've never been a guy. One of the things, the demographics of the Navy has changed significantly since I came in. It is a much more diverse force and much more reflective of the demographics of America. And I think when I started as a midshipman, it was about 5% women. We're about just under 18% women now, officer and enlisted. And so I don't just lead men. My teams are now men and women. But I would say what's really different is this generation of junior leaders. They don't see the world so much in terms of gender, and they don't see the world so much in terms of diversity. They tend to see the world as individuals and more accepting of differences between people. And that speaks to a great nation in the future. Gosh, so the ship was out of Holy Loch, Scotland, and actually the first thing I remember is the weather. And everybody had said, "Oh, the weather is miserable," and I got there in November, and it was overcast and cool, and I thought, "Oh, this is okay." And then it started raining a week later, and it didn't stop raining till May of the next year. I started off in deck department, and I had a grand bunch of bosun mates, and that's a great starter experience for a leader. And they do the outdoors deck activities for ship. So they manage the lines in order to bring another ship alongside. You literally, it's manual labor. You pull in lines. They do the crane operations on the ship. They move the cargo around the ship. It was a submarine tender. But what really also made me think about that time frame, so this is the 80s, early 80s. So we still have in our crew the last of the sailors who came into the Navy so that they weren't conscripted into the Army. And I had a seaman who was 55 years old. And he had made it all the way up through the ranks and been busted down twice in his career. And motley crew might be a better way to describe that first group of sailors I had, but they were hardworking, mission-oriented, but they had not come into the Navy for the same reasons people come in today. And so it was a little bit motivational difference as a leader. So I was the main engines officer, had about 110 machinist mates working for me. I was responsible for my section of the propulsion plant, basically making the ship go through the water. So she was a World War II era ship, so it was hot work. The plant was generally sometimes 110, 120 degrees, and tough engineering work. You had to really know the systems and to be able to operate the plant. And the next thing that came to my mind, she's now a museum in Corpus Christi. But it's actually later on in life, as I met other veterans who served on her, she's been a wonderful point of connection, because earlier I would meet veterans who had served on her in World War II. And it's pretty neat to be able to talk to someone who served decades before you and have a ship in common and swap some sea stories. Ammunition ship, so this is significant. When I started in the Navy, women women serving on ships had just opened up, but we were prohibited from serving on combatant ships by law. And then in the 80s, the Navy designated logistic ships as non-combatants. That meant women could serve on ships that deployed. So up until then, I was serving on ships that might be forward deployed, but they couldn't go into basically what would be considered a war zone. And then getting assigned to the ammunition ships, I was chief engineer. I got there about a month before we deployed to Desert Storm. So this was going to be, for many of us on the crew, our first time going into harm's way. The ship was integrated. There were not a lot of women. I think maybe about 15% of that crew was female. I think myself and the chaplain were the two senior women officers on board as lieutenants. I promoted between the two ships to lieutenant commander, and I was the first lieutenant, so I was responsible for munitions movement, cargo movement, the synchronization of all that storage of the ammunition. That ship had, when I got to her, she'd just come back from Desert Storm, and I had just come back from Desert Storm on the Mount Hood. And so our first operation was completely centered in the Western Pacific. That was during the time frame when the Philippines broke the relationship with our government and said, asked the militaries basically to turn the bases back over to the Philippines. So we were moving ammunition out of the Philippines and distributing that ammunition around the rest of the Pacific theater. Tortuga, she's an amphibious ship, so she carries Marines and their gear, anything from AAVs to tanks. So this was another major threshold and historic. So after Desert Storm, that's when the commissions came about, looking at the role of women in combat. And then by the time the end of '93 and the beginning of '94 comes around, Congress repealed the combat exclusion law, which prevented women from flying aircraft in combat and prevented women from serving on combatant ships. It was the review by the Presidential Commission and I believe a Congressional Commission on what had happened with women during Desert Storm. And I think they came to the conclusion that even though women were in support units like ammunition ships, you're in the middle of the theater. And in our case, a mine was not going to discriminate between whether it was a cruiser or an ammunition ship. And the same for women who were flying aircraft. If you're flying a support helicopter in a combat zone, you might as well be able to fly a fighter aircraft. So Congress looked at it and then decided to repeal the law. But that meant amphibious ships opened up to women in the Navy. I was the number 2 in command, lieutenant commander, the same as a major. For a lot of us, it was exciting. There was a lot of uncertainty because at some point you have so much experience sets in certain types of ships, we weren't sure if we were going to be able to transition into another class of ships. So you look at, up until this point, my experience set has been in a support ship, a training ship, even though it's an aircraft carrier, and 2 logistic ships. And so to be able to move to amphibious ships, I need to make sure I'm well trained, well versed in how that ship operates. The driving of the ship is actually very similar. What's different is the movement of Marines. The flight deck operations are very similar, but pushing Marines out the well deck and the maneuvering of the ship to do that, those were new skill sets I had to learn. But what I found is the time I spent on logistic ships served me very well, because on logistic ships, you spend so much time resupplying other ships. You do some of the most vulnerable, high-risk maneuvering as a officer deck that you can do. You spend a lot of time alongside another ship in pretty close quarters, driving into the wind and seas and, maintaining this small distance over several hours. And very similar sorts of skill sets for maneuvering an amphibious ship to be able to launch craft out of the well deck or to launch helicopters off the deck. There was a group of us who all went to command of combatants at the same time. So Maureen Fadden was the first one to get to the waterfront, and she also had an amphib. And then Kathleen McGrath got to the waterfront about 8-9 months before me. She had command of a frigate, and that was interesting. The frigate was not modified for personnel privacy, so she was a woman SEAL with an all-male crew. And she took the ship on deployment and just did spectacular. And then I got to Rushmore in March of '99. I already had an integrated crew. I was a commander at that point, 05, same as a lieutenant colonel or colonel. Took the ship on deployment to the Gulf and came back. Great, awesome crew. That I was selected in spring of 2000. Well, first of all, our service is built around command at sea. Whether you command a ship, whether you command an aviation squadron. And so I'm not the only 05 CO on the waterfront by any stretch of the imagination. So we have 05 COs of submarines, 05 COs of ships. But what we want to have happen is if you've demonstrated leadership capability, you've demonstrated great performance in earlier jobs, then we want to be able to screen those people to become our commanding officers at the 05 and 06 level. It's a fantastic book. He walks us through our sort of cultural beliefs about laws of averages and the bell curve, and puts it in more pure mathematical terms and understanding, but then really gets into what our frameworks are and whether or not we really understand the risk and whether or not we really understand the system. And so if you look at life through that lens, you kind of get to the point of, I'm probably never really going to be able to predict the stock market. I'm probably never really going to be able to do that. But it also makes you understand that as you go through life's journey, that you're probably not going to be able to get the full context of the environment that you're in. And you have to posture yourself to be ready for surprise, because it's going to happen. It's not an if, it's a when. Oh my gosh, so this gets down to, how do you harness the talent of your people? And it's this, how do you get power out of what your people bring to the table? And we tend to talk about life as having this one great idea. And then, boy, if I could just have this one great idea, I could copyright it, I could reproduce it, you know, and then I'll be a millionaire. But in reality, it's the generation of lots of good ideas. That's what helps creates this pool of lots of different ideas, so that you could go, wow, that one, that one, that one, those are the really great ones we need to go after. So that's probably a very accurate sort of snapshot of where we were. And think of how much has changed in nuclear deterrence since that speech. You think about the START talks, the relationship with Russia, the formalization of processes for our militaries, the formalization of processes of how we communicate at sea for my service, so that we prevent miscalculation. And so when you look at a world of two superpowers who have nuclear weapons, and perhaps coming to an understanding of what Dr. Pauling indicated, the frameworks were created for those two nuclear powers to be able to talk to each other, so that we maintained strategic deterrence and never got to the point where we actually fought a nuclear war. And that is pretty amazing, because we have never fought a nuclear war, despite the fact we've had these weapons. But today there's a new vulnerability. Now we have more than just two nations with nuclear weapons. And so we still have to continue to have these dialogues and to set up frameworks and to establish processes with other nations that own nuclear weapons. Well, we're growing. So 272, we're on a path to, hopefully, I would say 6 or 7 years, we'll be up to over 300. And so I would say for the global footprint and the power projection that we have, and for presence around the world, we want to be at about 300, and that's surface ships, and that's submarines and carriers. 11 carriers are included in that number. And we have been able to generate presence and to be where we need to be when it mattered with that number of ships. So we have 3-star operational commanders around the world, and they report to the COCOMs, the combatant commanders that we talked about. And so each of the services has a military component that reports to a combatant commander. So our 6th Fleet commander has the Mediterranean, and then we have a commander for Central Command, and he's got the waters of Bahrain and Gulf of Aden and Red Sea all the way down off the coast of Somalia. That's 5th Fleet. And we have a 4th Fleet, which is a 2-star, who's got South American waters. And then we have a 4-star Pacific Fleet commander, And to put that in context, the Pacific waters are about 50% of the globe. We operate on a different model today. So we manage the ships we have, the 272 growing to over 300, and we generate those ships, and then we move them to the theaters where we need them. So sort of permanent presence, Sixth Fleet has 4 destroyers out of Rota, Spain, that provide ballistic missile defense. And then as we need other ships or assets in that theater, we move them to that theater. And the same with the other fleets. So Pacific Fleet being so large, we're moving to about 60% of our forces by the end of 2020 will be home ported, either off the west coast of America or out in Japan or out of Guam. But then even then, a lot of the other forces, we move to that particular theater as needed. So we leverage the mobility of our naval forces and send them where they're needed. 11 is the number of aircraft carriers, and then we normally have 1 in a complex overhaul at a time. So we're still in this area of we don't have stable budgets. And then for my service, it's probably particularly egregious because we look to try and build ships on a multi-year contract. And so if you don't have a stable budget, then it prevents you from doing things like making commitments to maintenance contracts. And so we have to have a stable process in order to commit with all the industry that helps us repair our ships and be able to commit so we know we have the facilities there to be able to train our people. And when we have uncertainty or when there is no budget and the government shuts down, then there's repercussions and readiness that go on for several months, sometimes year. So we will probably constantly be criticized for that and perhaps not constantly recognized when we come in on target, like with the Virginia class. It's a submarine. So as we work our way through this process, we'll design and build ships and work with our industry partners to get that right. But once again, this is where stable budgets can make a big difference in terms of us being able to obligate money and to do contracting in a thoughtful and deliberate manner. Unfortunately, I do not. So sequestration is actually still the law. And over the last few years, the Congress has come to agreements, a bipartisan budget act. But if we all of a sudden have a significant decrement in our top line with an inability to make good decisions about how to spend the money, it's going to be challenging. And what I think people don't understand is sequestration is not just a decrement of the top line, it puts constraints on how you can spend your money. So it's like having a household. And if somebody said, I'm going to reduce your salary, if you owned a home, you'd sit there and you would make decisions. Maybe I'll give up the cable. Maybe I won't drive the car as much and, save on insurance or something. But when you have a peanut butter slice across all of the lines of government, that would be the same as telling a house owner, well, take 10% off your mortgage, take 10% off your phone bill, take 10% off your car insurance. And at some point, you can't negotiate with the utility company when you're paying them 90 cents on the dollar. And so it's not sustainable. And we have contracts. So sequestration is pernicious in many ways, and for all of the armed forces and for all of the federal government. So I don't know when George Will wrote that, but when you think about the physical domains that the Navy operates in and we have submarines underneath the water, surface ships, aircraft, and the physics associated with the development of that technology and the sophistication of our weapon systems. In the last 15 years, it's become even more complicated with the cyber domain. And this nexus between the physical domains and the cyber domain, and our requirements to train, equip, man folks who are specialists in that domain, the understanding the connections between our current weapon systems and the support, the enablers that come from networks in that domain, from satellites to fiber. It is even more complex than a CNO of 20 years ago had to deal with. When I've been in command, I would say that's when you get your greatest sense of satisfaction. And some of it's when you're in command, you're with sailors and Marines, and they are people who make miracles happen in every mission. And you just can only be delighted as a leader to help work people through to mission success and to be an observer of that, and then to congratulate every single individual on the team who help you win the day somewhere.